This is my Lanshan tent. I've now spent over 100 nights camping in it, so it's a great time to talk to you about how it's performed, what's good about it, what's bad about it, and how it's lasted. And if you're thinking of getting one of these tents, who are you going to ask to find out if it's any good or not? Well, how about somebody who's spent over 100 nights in this tent? That'll be me then. So let's get started. Now, I try and make a habit of taking a photo every time I pitch the tent. I'm going to be sharing some of the best ones with you. Some of my best pitches, some of my most memorable moments, some of the best views that I've had waiting for me when I've opened the tent doors. And I have been using it with all of the modifications that I've made to it. And if those have been suggested in my other videos, there's a link to them up here. I haven't come across any additional changes or enhancements or improvements that I choose to make to this. I've used this tent on all kinds of trails. The most notable ones were the Cape Wrath Trail, where I camped every single night using this, the Skye Trail, the Hebridean Way, and lots of other long trips around the UK. Snow and ice in Dartmoor. I spent 3 nights in sub-zero conditions in the Brecon Beacons with it. On the Skye Trail, we had several really rough nights, and in particular one very windy one on the Trotnish Ridge. So it's had gales, it's had rain, it's had snow and ice. It's had all kinds of conditions to contend with. Let's take a look at the tent and see how it's lasted. Better than me, that's for sure. Now, the first thing I've got to say is how well this tent is looking now. It's still looking pretty good. The only marks and stains are probably as a result of my misuse of the thing. All of the stitching is in perfect condition still, and the fabric is still nice and tight over most of the areas. This thing is still pretty much as good as new. I want to draw attention to this mark there. Can you see how the fabric's creased and stuff? That's my fault. I deliberately sprayed some insect repellent spray onto the fabric. Big mistake. Don't do that. The fabric really does not like it. That is a patch over a hole that was made by I think it must have been some kind of a rodent. Just inside that spot I had my food rubbish bag, but I think the smell was just too tempting for Mr. Mouse, and he tried to nibble his way through the tent to get at it. So what I've done is to put a round patch of tenacious tape over that spot, and that's holding up fine. There are a few other marks on the tent just from wear and using it, and in particular there's one here on the door, which, believe it or not, is after sun. Don't ask. The stitching holding these tabs in place failed and they fell out or pulled out, and so I've had to go on and bended knees and beg my wife to carry out a quick repair on the sewing machine. Now you might see that I have actually run a line of sealant down the seams on this Lanshan 2 standard. Now that isn't absolutely necessary really. It was a real belt and braces thing when I got the tent and I was all enthusiastic. If your tent's not a pro version, you really don't need to do that because the seams are sealed from the factory. The one area that you do need to seal is where these tie-out points meet, and that just needs a few dabs of silicone sealant. Overall, when you look at it, it's still pitching nice and taut without any creases or flapping. And in particular, I'm pleased that this bottom seam is still really nice and taut. Certainly using the bungees on the bottom of the door helps to achieve that. So in the wind, set up like this, it really doesn't flap at all, and I get really good night's sleep. I managed to get this tent up now in about 4 or 5 minutes pretty much every time. I've got a good system down, and so I know that once I find a spot to stick the tent in, I can be pretty sure of having a nice dry warm shelter in a matter of minutes. I'm not saying for a moment that I would choose to use this tent on a mountaintop in January, but unless you are halfway up Annapurna or something like that, this tent is going to deliver in most conditions without missing a beat. And one of the main reasons for that is that it uses the trekking poles as support. And trekking poles are always going to be stronger than any flexible tent pole could ever be. And so I believe that this tent is inherently more substantial than a lot of other tents out there, provided it's well pitched. And if you want tips about how to pitch this properly, then I've made a video about that as well, and the link's up there. Another thing I really appreciate about this tent is the colour. amazingly good at camouflage, if you like, for stealth camping, especially in the UK. You wouldn't have thought that a brown colour would merge into the mountain countryside so well, but it's amazing how well it blends into the scenery, and it's been a real godsend for some more, shall we say, stealthy camps that I've had to do. It only weighs about 1.3 kilos with all my amendments and additions, and including the footprint and pegs, and that's pretty impressive for a tent that's this capable, that's got space for 2 people, has got 2 large vestibules. Let's take a look inside the tent now. This place really is like a home from home for me now. I've spent so many nights in this tent, and it's still looking pretty good. And this tent is really cavernous if there's only one of you in it. In the winter, I had only like 8 hours, 9 hours of daylight. And so for the remaining 15, 16 hours, I was inside the tent. And in those types of conditions, having loads of space is extremely useful. So I have got a washing line strung up across the apex of the tent. And what I've done is to add an extra hook halfway along, which proves invaluable for things like torches and this kind of thing. And I've also added a cord grip so that I can tension it. I can get it slack or tight according to what I'm hanging up there. If there is one problem with the tent, is that it's not at all freestanding on its own accord. So you really do need to have every peg firmly in the ground to make it nice and strong and stable. Now, one particular shortfall of these tents is the internal pocket storage. There's one pocket, this bitty little thing, and it's only at one end of the tent. And frankly, it's quite small as well. So although you can keep a phone and a head torch perhaps in there, it's not much use for anything else. There are loads of other places around the inner where extra storage pockets could be added. And if I had one suggestion to make to 3F, it would be to add more storage pockets just to make this tent more practical and easier to operate in. For example, how about putting a pocket here? Or perhaps one spanning across the whole end of the tent instead. So the internal storage pockets are inadequate. Is there anything else that isn't so good about this tent? Well, a couple of things. Firstly, the stuff sack it comes with, I defy anyone to keep using that stuff sack. And on a wet, cold or windy mountaintop, there is no way you're going to get this back into the factory stuff sack. I've given up with that, and I now use a 20-litre bright red stuff sack that's so much easier, and I can just stuff the tent down into it without any trouble at all. The other thing is, of course, the pegs. Now, the pegs that come with the tent from the factory are very lightweight, short, but for British weather conditions and ground conditions, they're not really big enough, and they're certainly not big enough for the main guy lines. So I've used all kinds of different pegs for the main guy lines. In very wet, bad conditions, I use Delta pegs, but otherwise I just use some 6-inch titanium pegs, which have got a much wider angle to them and grip the ground really well. Oh, and there's one other really big thing that I don't like about this tent, and that's these main zips. They're not two-way zips. So they're only open from the top down. So in the morning, when you want to have a peek outside, or when you're cooking and you want to ventilate the vestibule, you could really do with being able to open the zip from the top. But of course, on this tent, you can't. Right, so my 4 areas that I'm not so happy with are the fact that the zips are only one way, the internal pocket is mimsy and we could do with a load more, the stuff sack that comes with the tent is far too small to be practical, and the tent pegs that they supply a bit mimsy as well. You certainly need some beefier ones for the UK. And whilst I remember it, the peg bag that comes with the tents is made out of the same material as the fly sheet, which unfortunately is very stealthy, and that means it's extremely easy to lose the peg bag when you're pitching or taking the tent down. So what I've done is to replace it with a nice bright red bag that is much easier to spot when it's in the undergrowth in heathland halfway up a hillside. So the tent has got its shortfalls, the little niggling touches that could be improved. But when all's said and done, just taking a step back in looking at what this tent is and what it can achieve, I think it's absolutely unbeatable. You've got to remember that this thing costs, I don't know, about £150 landed on your doorstep these days. And a tent as capable of that for the price is impossible to beat, I think. Anything approaching its interior space, strength, versatility and lightness is going to cost you 3 or 4 times as much. So in terms of value for money, for the space and the weight, it's unbeatable in the UK. And I wonder if that's why some people look down their noses at it, at the Lanshans a bit, because they are very cheap tents and good value. But I defy anyone to find something that's as capable for the weight and for the price. This tent has allowed me to do things that other tents would not have made possible. Because it's so lightweight, spacious and capable of dealing with all kinds of conditions, I've been able to go out on trips with confidence that at the end of the day I've got a warm, dry, secure shelter to sort myself out in. And I can't tell you how much that means when you're slogging away through a rainstorm up a windswept hill. Looking back through some of these photos has brought all kinds of memories of trips and experiences that this tent has been with me on. It's become a bit of a old friend, really, a bit of a home from home when I'm inside the tent, and so it's a trusted companion. Oh, if only this tent could tell stories. So are there any other tents that I would now consider instead of buying this thing? To be absolutely honest, no. I have looked around. Some of the Durston tents look very nice, some of the tarp tents, and of course everyone would love to have a DCF tent, wouldn't they? But for the price that those things cost landed in the UK, frankly my budget can't run to that, and I'm quite happy to make do with this. Thank you very much indeed. Those are my thoughts of this tent after spending 100 nights in it over the years. I'd be really interested to know what you think about it, how the modifications have worked out for you, whether you've got any thoughts about the tent after so much usage, and if you've got any other thoughts about how it could be improved. I'm all ears. I'd be very interested to hear what you've got to think. But for now, thanks very much for watching. Like and subscribe to the channel if you can, and check out all my other videos showing how I've been using this on through hikes in the UK.